Good afternoon. My name is Sam Westrop. I direct the Middle East Forum's Islamist Watch project. The webinar today was originally to be titled Enough Talk, a look at MEF's activism efforts against Islamism in the United States. Unfortunately, our guest for that is unable to make it, and we've postponed that for another time. So there will be a little more talk while we wait for our Enough Talk webinar, but I'm delighted to say we have Dexter Van Zile with us, the managing editor of Focus on Western Islamism, our counter-Islamist media outlet. And the timing actually worked out rather well because Dexter has just published a very important investigative piece on Massachusetts funding, state funding of a collection of radical organizations. And so I'm delighted to welcome Dexter to discuss this question of taxpayer funding, of the government subsidizing and thus legitimizing Islamists here in the United States. Dexter, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, before you tell us what you've uncovered in Massachusetts, I wanted to point out that, for the last few years, we've published a long series of pieces on federal funding of Islamism in the United States. And that amounted to tens of millions of dollars of funding going into the pockets of some very rotten characters. That occurred under every administration, Republican and Democrat. What we're starting to do now, I understand, is look at state funding, state and even city and local funding. And from the sound of it, these early investigations are uncovering quite a bit. Dexter, tell us what you found in Massachusetts. What is the Massachusetts taxpayer funding?
Well, one of the things that we found is that the state has either funneled federal money or given local money to two nonprofits that are affiliated or led by Imam Abdullah Farooq of the Mosque for Praising Allah in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And ironically enough, one of these is actually, security funding provided by the federal Department of Homeland Security that's funneled through the state. And essentially, what makes this ironic is that this mosque is led by Imam Abdullah Farooq, who is basically one of the most ardent and vocal defenders of Aafia Siddiqui, who is essentially had been found is serving 86 years in prison for attempted murder of U.S. personnel in Afghanistan. And so what we have is that's about $100,000, and that was a Department of Homeland Security grant that was administered by the state of Massachusetts. And then there was another almost $300,000 from the state for food security in Roxbury, which is a neighborhood of Boston, and it was used to basically improve the equipment used at a food pantry at Farooq's mosque. And I think, and what that does is that kind of actually, when you get money from the state or the federal government, what that does is that establishes you as a player in the city. And if you look closely at his historical record, this is not a guy that you want to essentially legitimize or help mainstream because of his enmity towards the United States and his role towards in facilitating and promoting anti-American extremism and Islamism in the U.S. And it's very troublesome. But the problem is that it doesn't seem to generate a lot of concern on the part of public officials, either in the state or on the federal level as well, historically.
So Aafia Siddiqui was this prominent Al-Qaeda operative, viciously anti-Semitic, clearly dangerous, named by the FBI as this very dangerous operative. So what exactly was the nature of Abdullah Farooq's involvement with her? Was it just general support, express support, or did it go further than that?
Well, one of the interesting things is that essentially, first of all, he's been defending her ever since she was arrested in 2008. But he was working with her before that in one of the books that was written about Aafia Siddiqui. Deborah Scroggins interviewed Farooq, and he basically described and acknowledged how she would obtain books essentially, written by Saeed Qutb, and then distribute these books in Massachusetts prisons while he was working as a chaplain for state prisons for the Department of Corrections here in Massachusetts. And also, essentially, he's said some very aggressive things about how, his supporters should actually take up, the gun and the sword on behalf of Aafia Siddiqui, and also kind of follow her example. That people he called upon his listeners in 2010 to grab onto this rope, grab onto the typewriter, grab onto the shovel, grab onto the gun and the sword. Don't be afraid to step out into this world and do your job. Now, when I talked to him about this a couple of weeks ago, he basically said, look, I wasn't really calling for violence against the United States, that I was essentially calling for a reform or an improvement of the United States. But in the context of Aafia Siddiqui, who, during her trial, one of the things that she said is that she didn't want any Jews on her jury sitting in judgment over her guilt or innocence. And at one point, she talked about having a DNA test essentially, conducted on the people in the room to make sure that they could keep the Jews out. This is the type of thing that she did. And ultimately, if you look over at his history and the rhetoric that he said over the years, it's not really that much of a surprise that he would actually defend her. And so he's had a long affiliation with her, and he's downplayed the threat that she presented to American personnel in Afghanistan, saying that she was just this little girl. They couldn't control this little girl, when in fact she basically grabbed a gun and tried to shoot U.S. FBI agents and soldiers. It's while screaming or while yelling anti-American slogans. So it's a very troublesome connection between Farooq and Siddiqui, and his own rhetoric itself is actually very troublesome as well. The Middle East Media Research Institute has documented how he's essentially said that America is a terrible place. But when you talk to him in person, he said, well, America is the country of my birth. I love this country. But then he would, previously, just last year, he said that America is a terrible place where perversity is normalized and gay marriage is tolerated. So, I mean, this is what he's about. I think ultimately what he does is that he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. When he's confronted with somebody with a pen and a notebook and a tape recorder, he'll talk nicely to the larger community. But when he's speaking to a sympathetic audience, he will say outrageous things that make it clear that he doesn't like the United States.
Okay. Now, we've had quite a few people join us since the start. So just to reiterate that the webinar with Ben Baird has been postponed. He will be back with us in a few weeks. But with Dexter Van Zile, who is discussing Massachusetts state funding of Islamism. If you have questions for Dexter, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to the question in a bit. So Dexter, from everything you've said, Abdullah Farooq is not the kind of person that should be receiving government support. And yet this money went to a fairly benign cause, right? I think it was food pantries and other things. So ultimately, is this such a big deal, even if the guy that runs the food pantry is rotten, at least that money is doing good? Or should we not see it like that? Okay.
While I was interviewing Abdullah Farooq, one of the things that he said to me, he says, do you see any Muslims in that line for the food pantry? And I said, no, I don't. And essentially, and if you go into the Roxbury, you will see a fair amount of suffering on the part of the people who live in that neighborhood. There's no doubt about it. The problem is that when you start to give state and federal funds, taxpayer money to an individual like this, and to the institutions that he runs, it essentially legitimizes and helps mainstream this type of ideology. Because it also essentially demonstrates that he's a player in city politics, and clearly he is. And if you go to the institution that runs the food pantry, the multi-service organization that he runs, you will see pictures of former Mayor Marty Walsh, who's now the NHL players representative for the National Hockey League. You will see pictures of him shaking Farooq's hand. And essentially what that does is that it shows, okay, that we don't have to worry about the hostility that he promotes towards the United States. The problem is that what happens when somebody, one of his followers, actually acts on the ideology that he propounds. And the problem is that when our elites in the city of Boston do not essentially distance themselves and say, this is beyond the pale, we need to draw a cordon sanitaire around civil society, so to speak, in American society. And this is beyond the pale, and we're not going to tolerate it. When you don't do that, it basically sends a message to other people that, our elites are too stupid to really recognize what's going on, or they just lack the courage necessary to stand up to it. And so, and we see this problem play itself out in virtually every Western democracy that we've looked into. You will see in Sweden, radical mosques get public funding. Okay. Same thing in France, same thing in the United Kingdom. We see institutions that are essentially should be sidelined and marginalized. Some sort of caution tape should be put around these institutions. Instead of that, what we see is that we see elites handing them the money that they can use to essentially establish themselves as credible institutions in the cities that they operate in. And it also frees up money for these institutions to actually then promote, so that they can use the resources that they have, pre-existing resources that they can use to promote their extremism. And that's a very troubling thing. You have to keep reminding people, money is fungible. And if you give an institution $100,000 for one purpose that it would need to come up with on its own, it can use that money for more, the money that it doesn't have to spend on that purpose for more nefarious purposes.
Yeah, understood. Now, I know you had a bit of a chance to review the Massachusetts funding to Islamic organizations more generally. Are moderate mosques also getting this kind of money to do this kind of work, or is the government essentially, and you spoke about this idea of legitimizing people like Farooq, but is the government essentially not just elevating the extremists, is it also sidelining the moderates as well with this funding?
Well, and we're going to have to dig some more into this, but it looks as if there are actually some essentially moderate institutions or responsible institutions that don't have any Islamist ties, no radical ties, that are getting money as well. The problem is that I don't think that there's really any oversight or even any notion that some groups should get money and others should or shouldn't get money. And I think that there's a tremendous fear of being called Islamophobic or racist on the part of public officials to say, look, there are some institutions that we will not fund. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to kind of document in the weeks and months ahead at FWI. If we can get people to talk, that's a really, one of the things that we have found at FWI, and I think you're familiar with this, Sam, is that, we've done stories, funding about in Illinois. People will not go on the record to explain how or why these institutions got the funds that they did. Particularly one institution that was affiliated with the Nation of Islam, which clearly promotes a hateful agenda towards white people and Jews in the United States. They will give the money, but when the average citizen or journalist comes up and says, please explain to us how they got the money, they maintain radio silence and hope that people that the issue will go away.
Now, if you don't mind speculating for just a second, I know you're familiar somewhat with the politics of Christianity in America. Were we talking about two churches? One very extreme, perhaps had expressed some outrageously hardline positions on some aspect of society, and another ordinary church, and both apply for funding. Do you think in that case, the state government, say of Massachusetts, would discriminate, would say, well, hang on a second, we want to fund these churches to run these food pantries, but we won't give the money, or we're less likely to give the money to a church that takes such a hardline position as this one? In other words, is there a double standard here between the way?
I think, yes, I think there is a double standard. And this is the idea, the scenario that I keep springing out in my mind is to suppose the Westboro Baptist Church, which is a hateful church located somewhere in the Midwest. I used to know exactly where it was located because I would use this talking point a lot. But essentially, it was a church that promoted hostility towards Jews, gays, and lesbians. When I worked at the Committee for Accuracy at Middle East Reporting and Analysis, I used to get weekly faxes from them on a regular basis. And, some days we would look at the faxes and say they really brought the heat today, but there's no way that that an institution like that would get money without somebody having to explain themselves. They would say, look, this is an open thing. We can't deny them the funding because of the First Amendment. Suppose they got money during the COVID thing, the COVID pandemic. And the thing is at least people would talk about it. This is kept under the rug. And I think part of it has to do with urban politics, particularly here in Massachusetts and in the city of Boston, because essentially there's an awful lot of guilt over the racial problems in the city, and nobody really wants to confront an African American over his extremist ties and some of the hateful things that he said. And so essentially, and that guilt and that concern is, manifestly present in the elites in the city of Boston. And you can understand to a certain extent that they would rather that the issue would just go away, and they want to be able to downplay and suggest that there's no problem here. But look, the Boston Marathon bombing indicates that we do have a problem with, radical ideologies in the city. And essentially, and I don't want to go back to 9/11, but essentially, look, the terrorists came through Logan Airport. And so this is, and any responsible official in a large city like the city of Boston, they have to start paying attention to security issues and ideological concerns. But the problem is that we've allowed our guilt over our racial history to stifle honest and open discussion about these issues.
Yeah, understood. Now, you mentioned Illinois. I understand FWI also has some work coming out in other states funding Islamists, other cities funding Islamists. I mean, I can't ask you to put a figure together because we've no idea, but just based on what you're finding in Massachusetts, what you found in Illinois and Michigan, we could be talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars going into the pockets of Islamists across the country here. Again, a speculative amount.
And that's a huge problem, because one of the things that you've written about is that essentially now the Islamist community here in the United States, it used to be dependent on Islamists from overseas, particularly the Middle East, to kind of fund their operations. If we are giving Islamist organizations, but now the money's flowing in the opposite direction. The money and influence appears to be flowing in the opposite direction. And what that does is that if we fund Islamist organizations here in the U.S., that frees up resources that they can use to foment problems in other countries as well. And I think that the American taxpayer, it seems kind of an obvious thing to say, but it has to be said. We have an obligation to maintain oversight over how our money is spent and who gets it. We would never, ever tolerate the KKK or some sort of KKK-affiliated institution receiving federal funds. It just wouldn't happen, because essentially people would be able to draw a connection between that money and church bombings without even having to think about it. They would understand this is intolerable. The problem is that people have a tougher time drawing the connection or seeing the connection between the funding for Islamists and the mistreatment of religious minorities, say, outside the United States, and the deprivation of people's constitutional rights, and the negative impact on women's rights in Islamist communities as well.
Yeah. Why is the media not and I don't mean focus on Western Islamism. I mean the more mainstream media, especially at the local level, Why are they not stepping up here? Because it's not just left-wing governments, both at the federal, the state level, doing this. It's everyone. Government everywhere are funding the wrong people. So why are local journalists not investigating this and holding?
Well, I think some of it might very well be the fallout of the lawsuit between the Islamic Society of Boston and the David Project a long time ago. That took place, the early 2000s. And essentially, I think that put everyone on notice that essentially that if they cover this issue, they might be subjected to real litigation, which is and that's a concern. And I saw, I was involved with the community back then, and I saw the fear on people's faces when they were dealing with the litigation associated with the Islamic Society of Boston. Nobody really wants to invite or expose themselves to that litigation. And it's a very worrying thing. Another thing is, I think it's just exhaustion. People don't really want to have to talk about or think about Islamism anymore. And I think that there was an awful lot of, it was the Boston Marathon bombing was a profoundly troubling event. And it aroused feelings of disgust towards this ideology. And so a lot of people just didn't even want to have to think about it anymore. And I think that's really the issue is that there are some issues that at a certain point they become kind of, they don't want to talk about them, not because they don't pose a threat to their welfare and their well-being. It's just that it arouses such feelings of revulsion that they'd rather just ignore it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Roz and Michael Shorenstein ask, well, what can be done to stop this? What can be done to stop governmental support for Islamism? What is being done?
Well, I think one of the things is that the first thing one of the things it's a fantasy and I think it's a crazy one, but it's a real one, is suppose there are, campaign stops for state and federal officials, and they are essentially asked about public funding of Islamist institutions, and they're forced to essentially speak about this on the record in front of a camera and say, is it okay for these institutions to get this money? Yes or no? And that will actually be, I think, and people need, when they raise that issue and they put it on the agenda and in such a way so that they can't just keep the door shut. Now, and I'm not a, hugely experienced journalist when it comes to covering the State House here in Massachusetts. But essentially, you'll have a very difficult time finding any of these lawmakers in a way to be able to talk to them. I can talk to a few of them about the bill for the Muslim American Commission that they made. I spoke to two lawmakers briefly, but they didn't really want to talk on the record. As long as they don't have to talk on the record in front of a camera about these issues, they're going to continue to do what they've done. And suppose if somebody actually ran against them in such a way that forced them and said, this is an issue and it's your fault. And if it got on YouTube, if it got on Twitter, if it got on, whatever social media that Zuckerberg's starting again today, that would be a good thing, because that would actually, if we can get people to speak on the record and at least explain themselves about why, and then say, okay, well, now solve the problem. I think it's just grinding local politics.
Yeah. Now, if you do have more questions for Dexter, please enter them in the Q&A box below. Stuart Broad asks, Dexter, as we know, Massachusetts is one of the most left-wing states in the United States. It was also the site of the notorious mapping of Jewish institutions in that state under the pretext of identifying Zionist organizations. Is there any resistance among Massachusetts Democrats to this creeping danger of the proliferation of Islamism and the inevitable violence that will flow from there? What do you think?
Okay. Well, first of all, I was mentioned by name in that mapping project, and so I'm kind of like, I was kind of proud to actually see my name in there. I'm finally important enough to be singled out like that, but I think there was a certain revulsion, and I have some ties to the left through my family, and most of my friends are on the left. Some of my best friends are on the left in Massachusetts. Okay, and and when you talk to local politicians, you know that they don't like it. But the idea that they're somehow going to engage in some sort of real campaign against this type of problem is not really there. They will speak vociferously about it, but then that's it. And I think, and also to be fair, I think that the local Jewish community, at least the elites, the JCRC and the ADL, they actually did come out pretty strongly against it. The problem is that they weren't doing anything that appears to be illegal, to the best of my knowledge, because it essentially, and I know I'm probably going to get criticized for this. This all looked like it was protected speech under the First Amendment. Okay, and that's, and so what did they do? They basically said, here are a whole bunch of people who do things that we don't like, and this is where they operate out of. Okay, and so that's how things roll. The problem is that it was very clear that it was essentially they were making a list of Jewish organizations, and they were talking about Jewish high schools and Jewish educational centers, and it was clearly an attempt to kind of intimidate Jews. And the problem is that I think that because the state is so far left, the powers that be really don't have to worry too much about any, like the conservatives, taking up the cudgel on the part of this issue. That's the thing, is so that they don't have to do anything. There's no real alternative to the Democratic Party in the state of Massachusetts. That's just how it is. And so if they don't do anything, or if they don't feel like fighting against it, it's not like there's going to be somebody, a cavalry coming from elsewhere in the state to fix the problem.
Yeah, understood. Now, the one last question. You mentioned a First Amendment protection for the mapping project. Similarly, there are laws that prevent discriminating when it comes to distributing funding. At the federal level, at least. So I know you're not a lawyer, you're not a legislator, but is there anything off the top of your head from your research and your thinking that can be done in the legislature, whether in Massachusetts or across the country or even at the federal level, to address this question, to try and stop the flow of taxpayers' money into the hands of extremists?
Well, see, now this is the problem. I mean, I just saw the movie Oppenheimer, okay? And one of the things during the 1950s and 60s is that if you were a member of the Communist Party, there was a real good chance that they would figure out a way to essentially prevent you from getting access to, government resources and holding particular jobs in the state. And the problem is that Joseph McCarthy basically kind of destroyed the credibility of that movement, or that whole policy, I think, with his irresponsible attacks on people that didn't deserve to be attacked on. But the thing is that suppose we did say, okay, Islamism, like communism and fascism, is an ideology that we will not fund, and that government resources will not be used to support. That would actually, it's been done in the past. There may not be a huge political appetite for that. But in order to do that, we would have to be very disciplined. And I think the Middle East Forum has played a role in this, in outlining what Islamism really is and how somebody can be a Muslim without actually supporting Islamism, and say that this is the ideology that we don't want to support. We don't have any problem with the religion of Islam, but this is the ideology that if you engage in it, and if you support in it, and if you affiliate with Islamist or jihadist organizations, you're not going to be able to get a security clearance, and you will not get public funds. That would probably be the way to do it. I'm not sure that there's ever going to be the appetite for that, given what happened to the anti-communist movement here in the United States. I think it would frighten an awful lot of people, and they would say, look, you're just going to be like the next Joe McCarthy. And so but I think you'd have to talk to lawyers about that. Could you do that? And possibly, but it would be a terrible fight. And but I think that would be an interesting thing to see.
Perhaps a topic then for our next webinar with a legal view to challenging this problem. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I've had a whole slew of questions in the last 30 seconds that we now can't get to, but they're all relevant and we'll certainly address them in future webinars. So Dexter, thank you so much for your time. For anyone who wants to read the details of Dexter's latest investigative article talking about all this, please go to islamism.news. That's the website of Focus on Western Islamism, where the lead story at the moment is the Massachusetts funding of this extremist Imam and his extremist organizations. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a pleasant weekend. And Dexter, thank you very much.